In the last video, we took a look at the creation of Fmv Games and what you could expect within that style of gaming. Today, we're going to continue through the evolution of this fad with point-and-click games by taking a look at two of the biggest titles in this genre, Phantasmagoria and Harvester.
Stay tuned, buckaroos. There's more to come on Range Riders Cowboy Roundup, so don't go away.
Before starting this section, I want to point out that I did as much research as I could to make this video. There's a lot of times we get something wrong, and this may be another case of that. So, if I say the game was the first to do something, and you know that just isn't true, let me know in the comments below. With that said, in the last video we discussed the initial Fmv Boom and the mass amount of games that hit the scene in the years to follow. However, with the point-and-click games we're going to talk about today, we sorta have to start back at the beginning again, and you'll understand why in a bit. In the early 80s, around the same time Fmv was gaining popularity, the graphic adventure genre was starting to take off as well. In all honesty, this time period was just huge in general for the gaming market and everything was just taking off. The graphic adventure genre was pretty much exactly like the text adventure games, except they had graphics. Instead of reading, you're standing in front of a house. You now are able to see the house, as well as read that you're standing there. Even though this wasn't much, it definitely allowed for the creators to convey the rooms and areas that they had in mind during development. And just like Fmv games, the graphic adventure genre plateaued just as quickly as it was created. But this is nothing new, even today. Anytime something new and exciting hits the market, game devs will rush to make sure we're all sick of it in a year. But there was a subgenre that evolved from the graphic adventure format, point and click. This style took the graphic adventure template and simply removed the text inputs. Now, instead of having to guess what to type to advance to the next area, you could simply use the mouse to explore, move your character around, and collect objects. The first game to utilize the mouse was Deja Vu, developed by Icom Simulations Incorporated in 1985. And as you would expect for being the first to try this technique, it's extremely limited in what you can do. The Plateau of Innovation lasted for a decade until the release of Sega CD, which as you guessed is roughly the same time Fmv games transitioned to home systems. And eventually someone came up with the idea to put real actors into their games. That sentence is extremely vague, and that's because I couldn't find what the first game to do this was. So as an alternative, the earliest Laserdisc game I could find to incorporate real people was Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective Volume 1, released in 1991 by Icom Simulations. Similarly to Deja Vu, you had to click on options in the environment to progress the story. With the boom of technology and innovation, the only viable option at this point to make something new and exciting was to start fusing genres together. At some point, someone had the bright idea to fuse together the game elements of a point-and-click game with real actors, which makes sense. Instead of clicking a button and seeing pre-scripted scenes, you were now able to tell the actor to go to a specific location or perform a specific action, and they actually would. And this escalated quite quickly to getting professional actors as well. The two I can think of off the top of my head is Christopher Lloyd in Toonstruck and Christopher Walken in Ripper. In most cases, the actors used in these games never really progressed too far with their acting career, so it was always eye-catching to see a big name associated with these kinds of projects. Obviously, there were extreme limitations on how well you can make this technology look, but we'll cover that in a little while. So within this jumble of innovation and combining genres came horror point-and-click games. Everyone loves horror movies, so why not play one as well?
Stay tuned, buckaroos. There's more to come on Range Cowboy Roundup, so don't go away.
As I stated at the beginning of the episode, we decided to take a look at two of the top games within the horror point-and-click genre, Phantasmagoria and Harvester. Unlike the last episode, it's up to us to figure out the story by playing the game. Harvester prevents you from knowing what's coming next by throwing unthinkable twists at you, while Phantasmagoria kind of just hands you the plot right away and lets you play through the resulting story. We'll start with Phantasmagoria for reasons we'll get into later. From the title screen, we're given a neat option to watch the intro, something you don't see that often. It starts off by showing us a man setting up camera equipment and taking pictures of a town with a creepy house, providing exposition for what this man does for a living and the town and house we'll be seeing in the game. We, as the audience, fly through the doors of the creepy house to unveil magic props floating around with creepy imagery. We then stop at a woman tied to a chair with a bladed pendulum swinging above her head. She screams and wakes up from a bad dream only to be trapped inside a metal mask, waking again from a bad dream for real this time. The photographer awakes next to her and they have a brief conversation about the bad dream, which then leads to an unnecessary sex scene. And that's it for the intro. Everyone on board with the story? I didn't think so. Let's dive deeper into what the story is actually about. When starting the actual game, we see the two characters already living in the creepy house. Through a substantial amount of world building dialogue, we learn that the two people from the intro are married, just moved into the creepy house, and the guy, whose name is Don, is indeed a photographer. Also, just to keep the information together, we eventually find out that the couple moved into this house because the lady, whose name is Adrian, is a writer and needed inspiration for her new book, but this information doesn't come up for a while. The whole first part of the game is based on exploring the house and building the story, as one would expect. While exploring, we stumble upon a letter in a dresser written by one of the previous tenants. Though somewhat vague, we can pick up on the fact that the lady was having an affair and her husband was getting suspicious. With more exploring in this massive house, we come across a room with a magician's portrait on the wall, which is presumably the master bedroom. Adrian decides to lay on the bed and fall asleep when all of a sudden hands come out of the bed Freddy Krueger style and try to pull her into the bed. And to save time, the anomalies just keep happening throughout the story. A floating goo cloud above a baby's crib, electronics turning themselves on out of nowhere, and so on. There's enough to happen on the first day of moving into this house that would make any normal person move out as quickly as possible. But that just wouldn't make for a fun game. Eventually we make our way into town and attempt to meet the locals, but everything is closed except for the real estate agent's building. We go in to speak with him only to be hit on and sexualized. This leads to us asking if every key was given to them when they bought the house, for the agent to reply that he gave them everything and he's sure of it. Upon checking out the cabinet, we find one of the biggest keys I've personally ever seen, which would be impossible to miss, give a smart reply back to the agent, and then head back home to open the big mysterious door in the living room. This leads down a corridor, which eventually takes us to a giant library-esque room. Here we find newspaper articles talking about a magician, and a letter in a desk about black magic written by the magician himself, appropriately named
Zoltan.
While inspecting the fireplace, we accidentally push a brick through the wall, uncovering what appears to be a hidden church room. We get into the room and start to look at a giant book, when a box sitting on the table starts to growl like a lion and then releases the pin from the lock on its own. Adrian walks over to fix the box, only to flip the lock open, releasing a green mist that flies upstairs to the photography room. Which brings up the question, if the spirit inside was powerful enough to remove the pin from the lock, how is it not powerful enough to push the box open? It needs outside assistance to release itself? Anyways, we hear a crashing sound from the photography room and find Don on the floor with a cut on his head, stating the ceiling lamp fell on him after he finished installing it. And that wraps up chapter 1 out of 7 chapters. So to keep this from being a 3-hour video, I'm going to speedrun the rest of the story. The next morning starts off with Adrian working on her book when Don comes in yelling at her and not acting like himself. It's pretty obvious at this point, but in case you didn't think of it, Don is clearly possessed by the green mist that came out of the box. Going back into town, we're now given more buildings to enter. The antique store owner tells us the history of our house, the life of the magician, and how several people were injured there, blah blah blah. The convenience store guy repeats a lot of this information and mentions the guy who lives outside of town that used to live in our house, which doesn't have any real significance until later. After an attempt at a happy picnic, Adrian sees someone poke their head around a tree. This turns out to be a guy who claims him and his mom are living in their barn and his mom needs help. We help the mom out of her predicament and she offers to work for us for no cost other than continuing to live in the barn, which Adrian agrees with. Adrian then makes her way to the highest point in the house to discover a greenhouse in the distance. After a lot more nonsense narrative to pad out the story, Adrian finds the greenhouse with a telescope next to it. After a weird flashback showing Zoltan, Adrian then uses the telescope to look at their house, discovering a secret room. She goes back home to find the secret room, which contains paintings, presumably of Zoltan's wives. The next day we go back into the room and see a vision while looking into the mirror. Here we see Zoltan torturing a wife in a device that looks a lot like what they used in a Saw movie. We go to another room with another mirror to watch another torture scene, which I'm only going to show a bit of because it makes me gag every time I see it. Okay, we need to speed this up some more. We find our cat dead, which Adrian believes to be the work of the homeless guy living in the barn, but come on, we all know it's Dawn. More exploring reveals a hidden passage system in the house that connects to multiple rooms, and we eventually find an auditorium where magic shows were held. On this stage sits the throne that was in her nightmare from the intro video, which she has a flashback to. Adrian then leaves the auditorium to find Dawn passed out drunk on a bench. The next day she tries to convince Dawn that they need to move out of the house, which is too many days too late, and this only angers Dawn. He gets up from the bench and reveals the cat's collar, indicating he was the one who killed her cat. Shocker. Adrian then goes back to the church room and finds another hidden door to the passage system she was in earlier. She follows it and winds up in the coffin area where Zoltan was laid to rest.
Zoltan!
We finally get a real conversation out of the man who lived in our house as a boy. Remember him? And he tells us about how everyone was murdered and the origin of the green mist, which was a demon that possessed Zoltan.
Zoltan!
Fast forward some more. Dawn is now full-blown crazy if you couldn't tell already, and Adrian finally has the thought to pack up and leave. Kind of late for that, isn't it? Instead of just leaving, she explores the house one last time and finally goes into the dark room Dawn has been in for the majority of the game. She finds pictures of her with each one cut at the neckline, and surprise, Dawn comes into the room. He gives a crazy speech and then captures us, placing Adrian into the pendulum throne on the stage. Before it's too late, Adrian shows him an item from their past, which distracts him long enough for her to pull a lever and kill him. A small earthquake happens and the demon is released from Dawn, which then materializes in front of us, revealing a snake-like being. We quickly escape through the hidden passageway and find yet another tomb that we apparently never saw the first time. Adrian then reads a spell from a book, places her blood on a talisman, and extinguishes the demon forever. That was just a whole lot of nothing. Similarly to Phantasmagoria, we get a short 3D introduction to set the mood for the game, and boy does it set the mood to confused very quickly. We wake up in bed and put clothes on before making our way to the living room. Our younger brother is watching the television, but when we talk to him, it's very clear we have no idea who anyone is around us, including who we are. We quickly find out our name is Steve, which leaves the only mystery left to solve being why we don't remember anything. Through some more dialogue, we get some vague comments about our mom possibly hurting our dad, and that we have a girlfriend named Stephanie that we're set to marry in 2 weeks. This is followed up by Steve making comments that the TV is retro, which the brother replies that it's a brand new television, which instantly has us thinking Steve somehow went back in time. In the kitchen we find our mom baking cookies, and she pretty much verifies all of the information we received from our brother, but something just seems off about the conversation and how she responds to questions. During the conversation she brings up a place called The Lodge, a building in the middle of town that everyone tries to get a job at, but almost no one succeeds. She insists that we need to get a job before the wedding so that we can support the family, so the lodge would be a good place to try. At least we now have some guidance on where we need to look. Once we leave the house, we are given free range to explore the world and meet the people in town. When we enter Stephanie's house to talk to her, we first meet her dad, who is strangely obsessed with meat and seems to only want this wedding to happen because our father works at the meat factory, meaning he'll get an unlimited supply. Needing to ask permission to see Stephanie, we go into the kitchen to ask her mom only to see that she looks almost exactly like our mom. Weird. She states that Stephanie is grounded to keep her safe from being injured before the wedding, but allows us to go talk to her. Upon getting to her room, we find that she also has amnesia and has no clue what's going on. Surprise, surprise. She goes on about how nothing about this town seems right, and that we need to find a way to escape. With the lodge always being brought up, it seems like that may be our only way to get answers and possibly escape. After exploring the town, meeting the strange locals, and collecting items along the way, we finally go into the lodge and speak with the sergeant-at-arms, who's guarding the door. But he points us in the right direction and informs us we need an application before being considered as a member. After running errands for the postmaster, we're given the application and can now turn it into the lodge. And once we do that, we're told that we'll have to do a series of tasks to prove ourselves. The Sergeant-at-Arms refers to these tasks as pranks and consist of scratching someone's beloved car, stealing fabric from the firemen, and stealing a barber's pole. Once we finish all 3 tasks, we're told that the barber was electrocuted after accidentally touching the live wires left behind from the barber's pole, The firemen killed each other over the missing cloth, and the man whose car was scratched is just angry. At least one person survived our prank. But the pranks aren't over yet. The Sergeant-at-Arms wants us to perform one last prank before becoming a member. We need to burn down the diner while everyone is distracted with the annual bake sale. Before we get a chance to finish the last prank, someone burns down the TV station. When we arrive at the scene, we see the postmaster running away with a gas can. Well, before it's too late, we need to hurry up and get our task done as well. So, we run over to the diner and set it on fire. The next morning, we visit the diner to see the aftermath, only to find a note from the owner stating that the diner was all that she had after her husband died, and now her and her daughter have nothing. So the only option left is to hang her daughter and then herself. After such a heavy scene, we go back to the lodge, only to find out that everything we just did was only a trial run, and we didn't even start the initiation process yet. Well, great. On the plus side, he tells us we'll be receiving an invitation, so that's nice. Upon visiting Stephanie to tell her the news, we find a spine on her bed, but no one really seems concerned about this except for our character. The sheriff comes in and deems that she died of natural causes, but states the only evidence they have is a card on her bed with the lodge logo. When we open the card, surprise, it's our invitation. The reaction of the parents and the sheriff push us too far, and we decide we need to start taking all of this into our own hands. We get into the lodge but immediately fall down a trap door, which takes us to what looks like intestines. In case you aren't aware of it, this is where things get really weird. We get word that Stephanie is somewhere in the lodge, so now it's our duty to find and rescue her. Which begs the question, whose spine was on her bed? The lodge turns out to be a giant maze of rooms and passageways, taking us to some very weird areas. While on the trek through the building, we collect a scythe, rifle, nail gun, and chainsaw to murder just about every person we come in contact with. This is also the time we find out that almost all of the residents of Harvest are members of the lodge. Eventually, we hear Stephanie screaming, so it only means we're on the right path. After killing 99% of the lodge members, we finally make it to Stephanie, who appears to be in a mechanical saw trap. Seems pretty familiar. She's released and we finally get an explanation of what's going on. We're in a simulation. It's designed by harvesters, or serial killers, to find and create more serial killers to release into the real world. Wait, what? The Sergeant-at-Arms then gives us two choices. Either refuse to join them, causing our machines to be unplugged and our life ending in minutes, or kill Stephanie to prove we have what it takes, releasing us from the simulation. It's further explained that if we refuse, although our death will happen in minutes, the simulation will make it feel like a lifetime, allowing us to live out our life in Harvest and marry Stephanie since she's the only other real human in this world. So either way, Stephanie dies. Being good people, our instincts told us to spare her life and get the good ending, which shows a montage of happy events followed by our eventual death. This results in an end screen showing two harvesters standing over the bodies talking about how it's a shame we didn't make the right decision, and how they need to get the next test subjects plugged in. And because our last load wasn't too far back, we decided to get back into the game and see what the alternate ending would be. After Stephanie is killed, we wake up to the harvesters looking over us, to which we exclaim, "Wow, that was neat." We're then shown hitchhiking on the side of the road when a car stops to pick us up. We get in, and then kill the driver. Back at our house, we're typing frantically on a keyboard when our mom walks in and asks what we're doing, to which we reply, "Playing Harvester." Super meta. But these are just the main story points of both games. We'll dive into more details in a bit. If you watched our video on Police Quest, SWAT, you would already know before clicking on this video that the graphics were going to be absolutely horrible. Although this technology was neat, they were very far from perfecting it. There was one very noticeable issue that was extremely distracting: the keying halo. Because the actors were filmed in front of a blue screen, all of the in-game movement comes with a blue outline of the character. There are also several occasions where there's just an unnatural blue glow being casted on the actor. This is usually caused by an actor standing too close to the screen, but who knows how big of a space they actually had to work with for some of these shots. The keying is a lot better during the cutscenes, with only some hints of blue showing up in the actress's blonde hair, but somehow they nailed it perfectly with the blonde hair in Harvester, which is quite impressive. We can't really fault them on the keying halo, since there were probably a lot of limitations they just had to deal with, but it definitely breaks any illusion there may be of the person actually being in the environment. But on that topic, the environments are pretty impressive for their time. All of the scenes are 3D rendered models and don't look too bad. It's definitely cheesy looking and not photorealistic in the least, but hey, they did the best that they could with the tools that they had. I was also impressed on how accurately they were able to match the 3D camera to the real camera of the actors for some cutscenes. It may not seem like a big deal, but the fact that they had issues keying out the blue screen makes the camera tracking a tiny bit more impressive. The music, however, is far from impressive. There's nothing horribly wrong with the soundtrack, it does its job within the game, but there's just nothing that entirely stands out. Creepy scenes have drony atmospheric tones, normal scenes have eerie music or somewhat upbeat songs, but at the end of the day, the songs fit the scenes well enough that it's not distracting. One odd thing I discovered is how similar the two soundtracks are. However, Harvester has a well-balanced sound between all of the instruments. No instrument seems to stand out more than any other, and everything sets the tone perfectly for whatever room or area you're in. On the other hand, Phantasmagoria seems to have picked random synths that don't mesh well together for a handful of songs. While Harvester sometimes used detuned instruments to convey an uneasy feeling, Phantasmagoria's attempt with detuned instruments is often combined with normal tuned instruments, giving you an overall horrible sounding song. And just like the music, the voice work isn't too great as well. Again, Harvester has pretty clean audio and it sounds like they actually used nice microphones and proper techniques for the live scenes, and recording booths for the voiceover and ADR work. Phantasmagoria sounds like they're in a warehouse recording their scenes. Because they are. There are several times a character will move their head to look at a second character, and you can audibly hear the clarity change.
I'm just looking at my plans here, trying to figure out the best way for me to do this.
Wow, you've been alive.
Yeah, it's really coming along.
If I had to take a guess, it would appear they set up one shotgun mic per scene and just hoped for the best. Although technically there would be some natural echo in a room, Phantasmagoria goes way too overboard to where it breaks any illusion they were trying to go for. And Harvester has no echo whatsoever, but it works better because there's nothing to distract you. Even though it's still not natural, it's a lot better than what Phantasmagoria was trying to pull off. Harvester even goes as far to provide room noises to the scenes to make it as realistic as possible. This includes buzzing of lights, a phone ringing in the background, crickets and birds, and so on. These little details make up for the fact that the audio is extremely crisp.
Stay tuned, buckaroos. There's more to come on Range Rider's Cowboy
As it was stated earlier in the video, these two games took the FMV style with real actors and combined it with a point-and-click adventure game. And if it wasn't that obvious, that's all you'll be doing through both of these games, pointing and clicking. Aside from exploring your surroundings, you'll occasionally come across puzzles that need to be solved to progress the story. And this is what completely separates the two games. As I said earlier, Phantasmagoria kind of holds your hand through the game and never provides any real challenge. As long as you click on everything and explore every piece of each room, you'll keep the story moving. They also make sure to guide you in the right direction every so often. For example, when we went into town for the first time, just about everything was closed. Later on, our husband tells us we need to go into town to buy some stuff, which was the game's way of saying, hey, things are open now. It's not like we weren't going to go back and investigate once the new day started, so it seems like events like these were used just in case you had no idea where to look. But aside from that, there was never a puzzle too complex to solve, and there were only 2 times in the entire game where there was a sense of urgency, which were the final 2 acts. And this is where Phantasmagoria rewards people who explore everything. For the second to last act, which is breaking into Dawn's photography room, we have the option to trigger that event whenever we want. This means we have free roam around the house to collect anything new that may be lying around, which is exactly what we did, and it paid off greatly. This is because the second to last act can go one of 2 ways. Either you collect all of the items necessary, which leads you directly to the scene where Dawn straps us into the chair, or you don't collect anything you need. In which case, you have to run around the house using the secret passageway that was found earlier to avoid Dawn, and collect everything necessary to finish the game. Using this option to collect the items allows you to find all of the people Dawn has killed throughout the house, which I believe you can't see unless you use this option to end the game. And this is also the time when you can actually mess up a sequence of events. Going into a room too early or not hiding in the right spot will cause Dawn to capture you and put you in the chair, leading to your death. So it takes a lot of patience to figure out which way to go and when you should be in what room. Similarly, the final act is the same way. You need to perform the ritual in a specific order to get rid of the demon. Needless to say, we died a lot here, but eventually got it and beat the game. All of these things can't be said about Harvester though. Because you have free roam of the entire town, you can go to any area you want at any time. This leads to no specific order of people who have to be talked to, at least in the beginning, and opens up a can of worms for solving puzzles. Almost all of the puzzles deal with figuring out how to get specific items from specific people. This often revolves around doing a quest for one person just to get the item you need for a second person, and so on. This game is actually pretty unforgiving when it comes to mistakes as well. For example, when we started exploring the town, we went to the military base and started talking to the colonel. As with everyone we encountered, we started asking a bunch of questions to get as much information as possible, but this doesn't work in this situation. Instead, the colonel thinks we're a communist trying to get information out of him, and he shoots us. This causes him to accidentally push the button for the missiles, destroying everyone in the town. We didn't even make it a half hour into the game before getting us and everyone in the town killed. Good to know. So, time to start the game over again because we didn't save anywhere, mainly because we thought it would be impossible to die so fast. This time when talking to the colonel, we chose our answers very carefully and, even though we had a few close calls, made it through the conversation without dying. The inventory system is also superior to Phantasmagoria. This is due to your need to combine items in order to get past a specific puzzle, such as using the pen on paper to sign it. In most games, this would be automatic, but Harvester makes you manually do it and think, oh, I never thought to do that. Harvester also has a mechanic that isn't really seen in these types of games, fighting, which you can see us doing here for way too long, trying to get used to how it works. But much like Phantasmagoria's storytelling, they wait until almost the very end of the game to give you a reason to fight. It's understandable to why though, it's not a very good system. There were several situations where we died in a fight simply because the enemy had a longer striking range than we did, which resulted in several unnecessary deaths. It didn't take us too long after that to realize that if you just click as fast as you can, your hits sometimes count as 2 or 3 even though the animation can't keep up. And the fighting only gets easier once you pick up an assortment of guns, though you have to be cautious of how much ammo you're using since there never seems to be any laying around. But that's pretty much all of the game elements you experience with these titles. However, before we finish up this section, there's one thing I feel needs to be discussed, and that's the horror element. If you remember from earlier, these two titles are considered horror point-and-click games, and it doesn't feel like that at all. I already pointed this out, but the first 5 hours of Phantasmagoria are there to get the story in place for the final hour of the game where stuff actually happens. And even then the only suspenseful parts are when we're actively trying to avoid our husband or the demon. So if you get scared of a floating goo cloud or a rocking chair moving, then this game is for you. Otherwise it's mediocre horror at best. And Harvester is even worse off. I even double checked all the footage before writing the script and couldn't find a single instance where something would be considered scary. Which leads us to what Harvester, along with parts of Phantasmagoria, truly is. An edgy shock game. Through the entire playthrough of Phantasmagoria, we only see a few torture scenes when everything is starting to come together, and as I stated, there was one that makes me gag every single time. And Harvester is basically these few torture scenes scaled up a million times and then put through the entire game. From the beginning of the game, you immediately get an eerie feeling about your environment. One of the first things you notice is every single person states the phrase,
"You always were a kidder, Steve."
It's a weird automated response that everyone seems to have and you can't quite explain why. It's the little things like that, along with their personalities, that make you feel uneasy a lot of the time. But the biggest thing Harvester prides itself on is the gore. From a teacher hitting a student with a baseball bat, presumably killing him, to going into your parents' bedroom and seeing the amount of blood and sex toys. There are several scenes that make you say, "What the f*** out loud. This was especially effective at the very end of the game, where you get to decide whether Stephanie lives or dies. When you choose the kill option, The game actually makes you hit her repeatedly with a bat until you use the fancy knife to kill her. As you can see here, we were waiting around for the game to end for a long time before we realized we had to do it ourselves. And the entire time we went through the process to just end the game, we felt horrible, which is the exact response they wanted out of their players. From our experience with SWAT, we had a pretty decent idea of what we were getting into with these two games. With Phantasmagoria, I was actually impressed with how slow of a game it was. I guess when I hear horror, I automatically have a vision in my head of what we may experience. But this misses the mark with its genre. And although Harvester missed the mark on the horror aspect as well, it at least had enough going in the story to keep us interested. These two videos were a nice time machine to an age of innovation and trying to push the envelope of gaming. I personally went into all of the games covered in this season thinking I wasn't going to have fun. And although that's partially true, we still found moments that were really funny or entertaining. So even if the games didn't convey the intended message, we still made the games fun in our own way. But with everything that was covered in these two videos, I'm relieved we can finally move on and get away from a genre that was only fitting for its time.
Wow!